Welcome to episode 107 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Greg Coleman, who served in the FBI for more than 25 years. He specialized in investigating financial crimes, money laundering, and asset forfeiture. In this episode, Greg Coleman reviews the criminal investigation of Jordan Belfort and the brokerage firm Stratton Oakmont for security fraud, stock manipulation, and money laundering. The case was chronicled in the Martin Scorsese movie, The Wolf of Wall Street, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. In the movie, Greg Coleman was portrayed by actor Kyle Chandler. During his bureau career, Greg Coleman was widely recognized as an anti-money laundering expert, and he is the recipient of the Director's Award for Outstanding Contributions in Law Enforcement. Many of Greg's investigations involved stock market manipulations where the proceeds were laundered through shell corporations and offshore bank accounts. Since his retirement, he has been operating Coleman Worldwide Advisors, where he designs and delivers customized live training related to detection and prevention of money laundering and suspicious activity reporting. The training incorporates real-life examples. Greg also is a frequent keynote speaker and guest lecturer, where he talks about the Wolf of Wall Street case, money laundering, body language and statement analysis, terrorism finance, and the truth about Bitcoin. If you want to engage Greg for training or as a speaker, you can contact him directly from his LinkedIn page or check out the show notes for this episode, and I'll have his phone number and email ready for you. As a former economic fraud agent, I was so thrilled that Greg allowed me to give him a call and be interviewed for this show. I want to thank my buddy, JB, for making the connection, and I also want to say congratulations on your promotion. I'm so proud of you. Everyone back in the Philadelphia division is so proud of you. Before we get to that interview, I have a few things that I want to say. The first thing is I have to remind you of the podcast meetup. If you're listening to this before March 18th, we're going to be at Busboys and Poets at 5th and K in Washington, D.C. from 2 to 5. I'll be there with the host of Once Upon a Crime, Twisted Philly, and Murder Road Trip. Please stop by and say hello. The other thing I want to say is join my reader team. Once a month, I send you an email where I talk about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And lately, I've been having a lot of fun critiquing movies and shows and telling you what they get right and what they get wrong, those cliches and misconceptions. So you can continue to support the podcast by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And you can continue to support me as an author by picking up a copy of Pay to Play and my soon-to-be-released crime novel, Greedy Givers, at Amazon.com. I don't do Patreon. I don't do ads. Thank you. Now here's the show. I am thrilled to introduce my guest, Greg Coleman. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Jerry. How are you?
I'm great. I am so excited that we're going to be talking about this case today. I worked economic crime most of my career, and this is the type of case that you could only dream of working. And it was your case.
Well, this definitely was a great case. But first of all, thank you for having me on and giving me the opportunity to speak about the case with your audience. It's always a pleasure to sort of share the info and the story that's really behind the case. But yes, I think this is one of those cases where, as an agent, I think there are more of these cases out there than people realize. Fortunately for me, I was recognized for the case. It got some notoriety. A movie was made and books were written, not by me, but by the subject of the case. But clearly it's nice to have your work recognized in that way. It was a very interesting case for sure.
All right. So what I thought we would do was to first talk about the case. If you could give us a nice, thorough, behind-the-scenes case review. And then after we're done with that, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the movies and the books, because one of the things I like to do here on FBI Retired Case File Review is to kind of go over those cliches and misconceptions that are out there about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. So can we do that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, let's do it this way. Let me start at the very beginning, because it's an interesting story. It's actually a case rolled in a case, because it really, from beginning to end, this investigation was a series of cases that each could have been broken out and separated into their own investigation. But for administrative purposes and ease of processing the paperwork and so forth, I left it as one big, giant case. It started, believe it or not, it was one of the very first securities cases that I ever worked during my time at the Bureau. And it came about this way. The subject of this investigation in this case, there were two primary ones. But for purposes here today, I'll speak mainly about Jordan Belfort. He's the most well-known of the two subjects. His partner, Daniel Porish, was involved with him throughout the entire investigation and is involved as much as Belfort. But clearly, Belfort is the one who wrote the books and got the movie produced, and is probably obviously the smarter and most charismatic of the two. It was in 1989 that he started his firm, Stratton Oakmont. And what's interesting is, it was in 1989 when I joined the Bureau for the very first time. Now, I came into the Bureau, I had banking and brokerage experience. I actually, for a short period of time, was a licensed stockbroker. And the interesting parallels between my experience and Belfort's is I got into the stock market right before the original crash, of our lifetime, and Belfort did also. The difference is, I got in, the crash came, and I got out and joined the Bureau. Belfort got into the business, the crash came, and he went and started his own firm afterwards instead of working for somebody else. So when he was starting his firm in 1989, I was starting my career at the Bureau. Unfortunately for the Bureau, we didn't even do securities cases in 1989. There were maybe one or two securities cases that had been prosecuted prior to 1992, and that's the key date, because that's when the Bureau finally sat down and said we should create a squad of agents who do nothing but investigate Wall Street related crimes. So it was in late 1992 that they formed the squad and invited me, of course, because of my background, to be one of the original founding members of that squad, which of course I happily did. And one of the reasons I joined the Bureau was because I wanted to work securities fraud and Wall Street related cases. Unfortunately, when I got here in 89, we weren't doing it. But by 1992, Belfort had already been up and running in his business at Stratton Oakmont for 5 years. And so he had a significant head start on us. He also had the advantage that we didn't have a knowledge base. I knew about the securities markets. I knew about money laundering, also having come out of the banking industry. But we didn't really have a strong depth of prosecutors, a strong bench of prosecutors who knew and understood the complex securities laws, because securities cases are a little bit different than other crimes that we investigate. And if I can give you an analogy, for example, it's if you see a transaction involving cocaine or heroin occur, it's never legal. That transaction is never legal to occur. So if you see it, it's very easy. You know a crime has been committed. But when you're dealing with securities, you see buying and selling of securities. And the first step you have is to determine, first of all, was that sale illegal? Because buying a stock can be part of a bigger fraud, which is illegal, or buying a stock as part of a normal transaction is totally acceptable and fine. And so you have this extra step there of even determining at the very beginning, is what occurred even illegal? And then once it's illegal, how exactly did it occur? Securities cases involve a significant tracing through paper and trading records. And at least it did in the very beginning. Since that time, of course, things have evolved. When I was leaving the Bureau and retiring in 2015, the Bureau was using more advanced techniques like wiretaps and so forth. They had digital technology was in place for surreptitious recordings and body recordings. None of that existed when I started this case. We were still back in the analog recording days of the old huge devices that you needed to use.
I remember those days? Well, yeah, I do. And, you were talking about securities, but those issues of whether it's a crime or not, having to start off with that premise is really related to most white-collar crime cases, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I think it does translate. For example, if you have a bank loan through a bank, the first thing you have to do is look at the loan because loans are legal to take out from banks. But of course, if you use fictitious paperwork to support the loan, then you have a false loan. So definitely, I think it is true with white collar. I think it becomes a little bit more difficult with securities because, for example, you have things like shorting, which is basically you're selling something that you don't own. In what other aspect of life are you allowed to sell something that you don't own with the intention of buying it back later, and it's completely legal? So, for example, when you're shorting a stock, when you anticipate that the price of the stock will go down and you want to buy it back at a lower price, you can do that in a completely legal way. Whereas outside of the securities markets, what can you sell that you don't own with the anticipation of being able to buy it back later? But I think your point is well taken, and I think it is right on the mark that generally speaking, in the white-collar world, there is that extra step that you often don't have in many other types of cases. But in Belfort's case, look, he was up and running very quickly. Very smart guy, very creative, very charismatic. All of the characteristics that make a criminal, a white-collar criminal especially, completely dangerous. Creativity, discipline. He had all of those things, so he grew very quickly. He developed a very loyal following, and that was, of course, one of the biggest hurdles that I had to overcome in the early days of the investigation. So when we finally created our squad, and I opened our case in 1992, which, by the way, I get a lot of credit for the investigation. I will say that along the way, I did get some assistance from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the what was known as FINRA at the time. They have since changed the name, but when I worked with them, it was FINRA. NASD. It's now FINRA, the National Association of Securities Dealers. They were our partners in this in some sense, in that when we needed records and we needed sort of technical advice in the early days, we could go to them. But in any case, we opened the case in 1992. Belfort is already up and running for 5 years. He's turning out deals at such a rapid pace that it becomes pretty clear to me early on that we can't focus on all of them. It's just not possible. He can create deals and sell deals faster than we can unwind them and even obtain the paperwork. It would take weeks and sometimes months to obtain trading records to see who was involved in the deals. And in the very beginning, there was some very big breaks that I developed early on, sort of related to but unrelated to Belfort, which became a key part of the case later on. And it focused on an individual by the name of Alvin Abrams. Now, Alvin Abrams was a man who owned a very small broker-dealer. It was basically him and an internal bookkeeper and a secretary. But he had been in business since the 1970s, and he was one of Belfort's primary mentors. He's the man who showed Belfort basically how to manipulate some of these deals. I found information early on linking the two of them together, and in particular, cash payments. Now, what's interesting is how this overlaps with money laundering is Belfort and Alvin Abrams were colluding together, conspiring together to manipulate securities. And as part of that equation, Alvin Abrams had to pay kickbacks to Belfort because Alvin Abrams was parking stocks at his firm. The price of those stocks would go up. He would make millions of dollars, and he had to kick a portion of that money back to Belfort. The way he decided to do that was to make cash payments to Belfort by withdrawing the money from his bank account just under the $10,000 reporting threshold. Of course, that is also a crime. It's known as structuring. And so very early on, within 2 or 3 months of opening my case by digging through bank records of people related to Belfort, I found a significant quantity, in fact, $2.3 million worth of structured transactions, 9,500, 9,700, 9,800, over and over for weeks at a time.
Just between these two people?
Well, I saw it coming out of Al Abrams' account, not knowing that it was going to Belfort at that point. But what I did know is this, and if you in a securities case, it's very easy to figure out who the bad guys are because you just look at who made money. And that's usually if you believe or you have reason to believe that the deal is manipulated. If you look at the trading and you figure out who it was that made money on the trades, that's your bad guys. And the people who lost money, of course, they're the victims. And so early on, it was clear that Al Abrams was not only making money, but he was helping because they were underwriting the deals together. And that gave me some probable cause to go get a search warrant and go into the firm and search for the books and records related to these cash kickbacks and how they were connected to the stock trading, which I already knew through the bank records. It was the first big break. We arrested his accountant, his outside an accountant who was doing his books and records, and we arrested him and we conducted a search warrant. And it was from there that I learned the first sort of breakdown of how the formula worked about the kickbacks and securities. And this was something that I would use throughout the rest of my career in securities cases. I would look for this formula. And this is the way it would work. If shares of stock were parked at Al Abrams' firm by Belfort, and they made a $1 million profit on those stocks, immediately off the top of that amount, 50% would go to the IRS to pay taxes. Because Belfort's position was he didn't want to get caught like Al Capone. Right? Al Capone got caught for not paying his taxes, not for his underlying organized crime activity. But in Belfort's case, he said, look, pay the taxes. We have $1 million profit. Take $500,000, just pay the IRS. That leaves $500,000. You give me $250 of it, and you keep $250 of it. And the method that Al Abrams was using to pay those kickbacks was by withdrawing the money under the reporting threshold. So it's something that's really not directly related to securities, which was our first big break and gave us our first insight into how these manipulations work. Because, for example, I had securities experience coming into the Bureau, but I didn't have it in this world, in the world of kickbacks. Where I worked, this wasn't going on. This was a completely new world for us as agents and as the FBI.
Did you tell us what made you look at them in the first place?
Good question. Let me go back to the very beginnings. When we formed the squad in 1992, people in management reached out to the Securities and Exchange Commission and to the U.S. Attorney's Office in both Southern and Eastern District of New York. And it was through a referral from the Securities and Exchange Commission to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Eastern District, and then Eastern District referred it to the FBI. It was one of the first referrals to come into our squad, and literally by the luck of the draw in some sense, I think it came to me, it was assigned to me because of my former experiences in banking and brokerage, and that's how the case began. In 2 or 3 months before we opened our investigation in 1992, the Securities and Exchange Commission sued Stratton Oakmont, and Al Abrams was mentioned in their lawsuit. He was not charged in their lawsuit, but he was mentioned. And he was mentioned as a person who was helping to underwrite the offerings of the deals that Belfort was getting involved with. So that's how Al Abrams came on the radar screen. The difference being is the civil people at the Securities and Exchange Commission didn't have the same ability to dig and obtain information and cooperating witnesses the way we did. I focused on the outside accountant first, and we arrested him, and he confirmed the transactions, the structured transactions. And that's what led us to the search warrant and the arrest and so forth. So it was through referral by the Securities and Exchange Commission to the U.S. Attorney's Office and from the U.S. Attorney's Office to the FBI that the case began.
Okay.
Now, from there, Belfort really exploded transaction-wise and money-wise. And to give you an example, he started in 1989. By 1994, on his tax returns, we use this as an exhibit in the trial, he declared income of $15.6 million. Not bad for a guy who was, I think, 32 years old at the time and in the business for a little bit more. But did he really make $15.6 million? And the answer to that question is no. He didn't make $15.6 million. He made closer to $30 million because he also got probably another $15 to $20 million. And I say probably because they're estimations on our part and his part based on transactions when historically we went backwards. Because remember, he was getting kickbacks from people because Al Abrams wasn't the only person giving him kickbacks. From 1989 to 1994, he had a select group of people who were making big profits in this securities trading, and they were making big profits because a big portion of that profit was coming back to Belfort. So in 1994, even though he declared $15.6 million, the reality of it is he probably made about $30 to $45 million. That's what we estimate.
Wow.
Almost double what he actually declared. And now remember, the $15 million is undeclared, untaxed, undisclosed cash. It's cash. And that's an interesting problem to have. And I call it a problem because ultimately it became a very big problem for Belfort. It's sort of the reverse, or it's actually, I should say, very similar to the problem that the drug cartels have. When they sell their drugs, they generate cash. But how do you get that cash into the banking system and use it and benefit from it without getting called? Because if Belfort deposits more than $15 million in cash, how does he justify it? His tax return says his total income is $15.6 million, which can be traced back to wire transfers from his firm. If you have another $15 million coming in cash, you can't justify it. There's no way to justify it. And so literally a white-collar crime criminal has the same problem that a drug dealer has. What do you do with all of that cash? Now, before I explain to you what he did with the cash, because that ultimately is his downfall, that's the big mistake that he makes that gives me the opening that I need to bring him down. Let me go back one step and explain in the interim what he's doing from 1989 until we get involved in 1992. What he's doing is he's combining two existing types of transactions. One is illegal, one is completely legal. He's merging them together. He's perfected the system, and he really has become very good at it. And I like to say, sometimes I slip and I say that Belfort sold stocks. Belfort didn't sell stocks. Belfort sold a story. And if he can convince the public, the investing public, of the story, they would insist on buying the stocks. They would want the stocks, and they would be happy to pay ever-increasing prices to get those stocks. And one of those individuals was for example, a good story was a guy by the name of Stephen Madden. Stephen Madden was a friend of Danny Porish's. They grew up together on Long Island. And when other kids in school were playing sports and involved in those kind of events, Steve Madden was designing shoes, women's shoes. And he ultimately goes on after school to go to Asia, has some of the shoes manufactured, and he's literally selling the shoes, trying to get them into all of the major department stores. He brings in an advertising firm who has a very successful advertising campaign, and the name Steve Madden is starting to become popular. Well, Belfort and Forish, the two guys at Stratton Oakmont, they know that that's a great story. It's a rags to riches American story. A kid from Long Island who is developing women's shoes, a man developing women's shoes, gets them made, gets them into the stores. It's a perfect story to sell. And they convinced Steve Madden to bring his deal, his company, to their firm and they basically underwrite the shares of his company. They bring his company public for the first time, selling an ownership interest of his country to the public through securities. That's a great story for them. They do very well on the Steve Madden deal. Unfortunately for Steve Madden, he's also assisting them in manipulating the stock of the deal. He's also a person who is kicking back cash to Belfort from other transactions. And to fast forward in the story, Steve Madden becomes one of the defendants in our cases. He pleads guilty to securities fraud and is ultimately sentenced to jail without cooperating with the government at all, and goes to jail for several years.
Could you explain for everyone what you mean by manipulating stocks?
Yes, and that's exactly where I was going to go next. How did Belfort exactly manipulate his stocks? I'm going to give it to you in a very general sense because you can get very bogged down in the details. But at its core, every single manipulation is done the same way. It revolves around a single principle: supply and demand. And what Belfort did with his securities was he constricted the supply, meaning he made the supply that was available to the public smaller. And the way that he made the supply smaller was by putting the stock in accounts of people who were friendly to him. For example, if I'm Belfort and you're my friend, Jerry, I send 100,000 shares of stock to your account. It's in your name. You technically own it, but I control it. And it's not disclosed anywhere. We have this unwritten, unstated agreement, but you know it because you know you're going to make money because you're my friend. And basically, I put those shares in your account with the understanding that when I want those shares back, I'm going to take them back. Whether you want to sell them or not isn't your choice. It's my choice. And so Belfort would constrict the supply. He would make the supply smaller that was available to the public by putting it in accounts like Jerry Williams. At the same time, that story, remember I said he was selling a story, he would get his brokers on the phone and they would create demand. So you have two things going on. You have a shrinking supply while you'll simultaneously have increasing demand. And that's how you get the price of a stock to go up. It's no different than any other commodity. When OPEC, the oil producing countries, when they reduce the supply of oil that's being pumped out of the ground and refined into gasoline, we know here in the United States, when they reduce supply, our cost of gasoline goes up. It's the exact same thing with a Christmas toy, a holiday toy. As you get closer to Christmas, there's only so many toys that have been made. The kids want the hot toy. The price of that toy goes up. And it's exactly true with securities. So Belfort constricted the supply by parking the shares in friendly hands while simultaneously increasing the demand by selling the good story. And that's how he would get stocks to go from $5 to $25 in one day or 2 days. Now, it would work this way. If Jerry was given shares at $5 per share, and we took those back from you at $25 per share, that means you had a $20 profit. Well, remember the formula. You don't get to keep your entire $20 profit. 1/2 of the $20 gets used to pay taxes. That leaves us $10. You keep 5, I keep 5. And you multiply that by the number of shares, and that's how much money was flowing around in these deals. Belfort combined, I started to say he combined two types of transactions. One, which is a criminal transaction known as a pump and dump, meaning you pump up the price of the shares. When it reaches a level that you've predetermined, you dump your shares, and the price will come cascading back down. An interesting parallel, take a look at what happened with Bitcoin leading up to December of last year. The price spiked very quickly, goes up to $20,000 per Bitcoin, and with days is cascading back down again. Now, I did these securities cases for 17 years. I can tell you that was manipulated. It has all of the hallmarks, all of the traits and facets of a securities fraud manipulation, except it's a cyber currency, right? But going back to Belfort, He takes a pump and dump and he merges it with an initial public offering, meaning brand new companies like Steve Madden. He took that pump and dump, he merged it with an IPO, an initial public offering. He sold the story, he constricted the supply, the stocks moved up, he sold, he cashed out, and that's how he made his millions. There were more bells and whistles, but at the core of every single securities manipulation, because a manipulation actually can be very different from a stock fraud, but I'm talking about manipulations. He manipulated the market. The core is supply and demand.
Well, how do you stop anybody from doing this? It sounds, the way you're explaining it, it sounds like, it's something, if you can get your hands on a new and upcoming, offering, that through marketing, good marketing, you could do this.
How do you stop them? Well, of course, we have laws in place. We have agencies to investigate it. We've gotten, and I say we, I'm no longer in law enforcement directly, but of course, it never really leaves you. When I started on that squad, we had seven agents working securities cases for all of the United States. We were in Manhattan, but when you work with the Southern District of New York, if you're tracing money, it always seems to come through Manhattan. So we have venue for securities cases all over the world, basically. Now, at the time that I left the Bureau, there were 3 squads of about 15 agents each. Wow. Doing nothing but securities cases, and offices in other parts of the country have also set up similar investigations and squads. So it's spread now. We have a huge knowledge base. It's been there since 1992. These cases can be worked much faster, much quicker than in the case of when we started. Digital technology has changed everything. When I started my case, literally, I would have to go through reams of computer paper. It would be that green and white line paper with the sprocket holes on the side. We would request trading data. It would print out on that form. And literally, I would have to cut Post-it notes into strips to be able to follow buys and sells together. We didn't even have computers at the FBI at the time. Nowadays, everything's dumped on it's sent to you digitally. You can plug it into an Excel spreadsheet. You can sort it. You can filter it. You can go through millions of transactions in a very short period of time and figure these things out. What would take me 3 months to do, I could probably do in 30 minutes today because of digital technology. It completely changed. Of course, it helped the bad guy do it better, but it also helps us catch them much quicker. Going back to the cash, because the cash becomes the interesting aspect of the case. And it really is Belfort's downfall. Because the difficulty with explaining these manipulations to a grand jury, prosecutors are concerned whether or not the grand jury is going to be able to understand these concepts. In 1993, Belfort does something that ultimately is the beginning of the end for him. He gets on an airplane and he flies to Switzerland, and he meets with a banker and he meets with an accountant. He goes to Geneva, Switzerland, and they basically teach him and school him in how to set up and use offshore bank accounts and offshore corporations. And from there, Belfort goes to London, and from there he goes to France, and he comes back to the United States. And when he lands on our shores, he's the proud owner of several shell companies incorporated in Panama, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, British Virgin Islands. And with those corporations come bank accounts. Now, the whole point of doing this is Belfort is going to put his cash to work. He's going to use it for what he does best, and that's invest in securities. It's what he's been making his millions at, and those millions have brought him an incredibly lavish lifestyle, fancy homes, fancy cars, but he has so much cash that he really can't even spend it fast enough. When he's making that kind of money, in other words, in 1994, let's be conservative. Let's say he made $10 million in cash. How do you spend $10 million in cash without getting caught? Because remember, anything over $10,000 There's a reporting requirement in our country. If he goes and he buys a car, he can pay, legally, he can pay $60,000 in cash. But by law, the car dealer has to fill out a form saying that Belfort brought in $60,000 in cash. And of course, that form goes into the government databases, which we at the FBI have access to. And the question becomes, where did Belfort get the $60,000 in cash? If we go to all of his bank accounts and there's no withdrawal of $60,000 in cash, it creates a problem. And so what Belfort does is when he goes to Geneva, he has in mind that he's going to get that cash over to Switzerland, and he's going to use the shell companies to invest in future deals. And instead of going to the Jerry Williams and setting up an account with Jerry Williams and putting that stock in Jerry Williams' account, because Jerry has to pay taxes. Remember, in our formula, you had to pay 50% to the government. Well, when I use a British Virgin Islands corporation, I don't have to pay taxes to the U.S., right?
Right.
And so right away, that portion of the profits, I don't have to pay to the government. And in the scenario where we use Jerry Williams, you only got to keep $5 of the remaining $10. I don't have to do that anymore because this corporation is me. It's my corporation. Now, I'm hiding behind nominee owners and nominee directors and nominee shareholders, but in the criminal stock world, ownership and control are two different things. When I put it in your account, you owned it, but I controlled it. I don't need to actually own it. I just need to control it. I can make my money by controlling everything. And so, in this case, I'm controlling the flow of the stock by creating offshore corporations. And what he does is he brings in another friend of theirs, whom Danny Porsche had grown up with on Long Island, a guy by the name of Todd Garrett. And Todd Garrett took on the role of being the mule to smuggle Belfort's money out of the country. Now, ultimately, what he did was Todd Garrett didn't move the money himself. He brought in his wife. And it's a perfect choice. Todd Garrett was a perfect choice because he's actually married to a woman who was born and raised in Geneva, Switzerland. She speaks French. She knows Geneva. She knows the banking system. And so you see this pipeline set up where the money, the cash, flows from Danny Porsche and Jordan Belfort to Todd Garrett. He gives it to his wife and some of his wife's friends, and they ultimately smuggle the cash out of the United States and deposit it into bank accounts in Geneva, Switzerland as cash.
Are they doing anything fancy, or are they just taking it in suitcases?
Could not be more basic. Literally carrying some of it, wrapping it up in their socks, putting it in their luggage, spreading it out among their different bags and the different people. The first trip that occurs is Todd Garrett's wife alone. And I don't mention her name. Any of the names that I've mentioned, for example, Belfort, Porsche, Steve Madden, Todd Garrett. The reason I mention all of these names is they were all arrested. They've all been publicly prosecuted. Their names are in the system. I won't mention his wife's name because we ultimately cut a deal with him. She was given what we would call a pass. Even though she was involved in the laundering of the money, she pled guilty to the main crimes and was the main source of cooperation against Belfort and Porsche. But he would give it to his wife. His wife ultimately brought in some of her friends. And so doing some of these trips, you maybe had 3 or 4 different people who were taking $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. At one point in time, the largest amount that was taken out, I believe, was $600 to some $1,000. I think that's the number. It's been so many years now, I don't remember the exact numbers. But they would smuggle these bags of cash out of the country and meet with the banker in Switzerland and deposit the money in the account. So with the account sitting there, Belfort doesn't want to let it sit idle. But it's now in the name of a offshore corporation. Belfort then uses investments from those corporations to reduce the supply of stock on future deals. And so he literally has complete vertical integration in his process. He's funding his own deals, and the people who are underwriting the deals are cooperating with him. And it's at the end of his sort of run. And I say this because in 1994, he eventually barred from the business. Now, if we go back historically, remember I said Belfort went to Switzerland in 1993, and that wasn't by chance, and it wasn't just because he had cash. He was creating an exit strategy also. Because remember, he had been sued by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and as part of his anticipated deal with them, he was going to leave the business. He was going to voluntarily be barred for life from the securities business. So in 1994, he's got these companies set up in Switzerland. He can leave the business. Danny Portish takes over the firm, and he still makes money through his offshore corporations.
I get it. They're still making the investment.
Exactly right. And so in 1994, remember, if you remember when I said he made $15.6 million, and that was the amount that's reported, that's when he really starts making the really big money because he's no longer regulated. He's no longer under the oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission or by the NASD or FINRA. He's not accountable to them anymore, and he can become an outside investor. And he becomes the outside investor through his offshore corporations. He ultimately sets up pipelines worth of deals where each month another deal is being done using those companies. And then at some point in time, he diversifies into other deals just to hide his tracks, to disguise the trail. But ultimately, you have this circular motion going on where the money is smuggled out of the United States, put into Geneva, Switzerland, and then it comes back as an electronic transfer into the United States into a deal. The deal makes money. It's electronically wired back to Switzerland, and then it comes back again for the next deal, and it goes around in this circular motion. What really was great for me was I understood money laundering, probably better than anybody I was working with at the time. And ultimately, by the end of my career, I became an expert in money laundering. I love money laundering even more than I love securities cases. And we alleged in our indictment against Belfort that the mere issuance of the stock from these companies to the offshore corporations that were controlled by Belfort, the mere issuance of that stock to those companies, that was the underlying fraud. And by doing that, all we had to prove was that Belfort was, in fact, the person who controlled those companies. And if we were successful on that, which we were, we then alleged that every transaction that occurred after that was money laundering. And why that is important is this. At the time of this case, securities fraud was not viewed as a serious crime. It just wasn't viewed as something like organized crime or drugs or violent crime or gangs. And it was not uncommon to have 10, 15, 20, $50 million fraud cases where the defendants would get 3 years probation. It was incredibly difficult to get jail time for white-collar criminals in 1992 who were doing securities cases. But by throwing in the money laundering, I had two benefits. First of all, it increased the amount of time that Belfort was subject to. At the end of our prosecution, he was facing 21 to 27 years for his crimes, meaning that if he was convicted at trial or if he pled guilty without cooperation, the judge was mandated. The court was required to sentence him between 21 to 27 years. And a lot of that was because of the money laundering. The other great aspect of money laundering was that we could seize his assets. We could go after anything that was traceable back to the crimes. Now, in our case, Belfort ultimately pled guilty, decided to cooperate in order to get a reduction from that 21 to 27 years, but he pled guilty to every single underwriting that he did. He allocated that they were manipulated, which meant that 100% of his assets from 1992 until we arrested him were proceeds of his criminal activity. And so he consented to the forfeiture of virtually all of his assets. We took his primary home in Old Brookville. He had a huge beach home in Southampton, Long Island. We see that. We see the Porsche 911, a Suburban, bank accounts, securities, you name it, we took it. I think the only forfeiture action in the history of the government where they took more was in the Bernie Madoff case. They even took his clothing and his shoes and his socks and everything. We didn't bother with that. That wasn't of interest to us. Anything of value we took.
What was he left with? Was he left with anything?
He was left with nothing that I could find. In these cases, what you find in white-collar crime cases, you reach a point of what I call diminishing marginal returns. The more effort you put in, you're not getting enough back. All of the accounts and assets that we could find, we took and we seized. Do I think Belfort was left with additional money? I don't think so. I don't know, and I will probably never know. Only he knows that as a matter of truth. But I'm very comfortable. I was a very aggressive, very diligent tracer of money. You know, money laundering cases are about following the money. I followed the money. I had significant cooperating witnesses, people who were providing information against Belfort. I'm comfortable with the thought that both he and Danny Porsche, I seized as many assets as we could legally grab at the time and keep. Now, those assets, for example, ultimately are liquidated and go through the U.S. Attorney's Office back to the victims as part of a victim restitution pool, which is what I always try to do in my investigations. Any assets that we see, we try and get back to the victims. But I think it's an important aspect of a white-collar crime case because the reason these guys do this, there's two reasons. One is power. Money gives them power. And the other one is just for all of the toys. Belfort had beautiful homes, really lavishly furnished. He at one point bought a boat, which is quite an interesting story. He bought a boat that was originally manufactured for Coco Chanel, the heiress to the fashion designer and perfume and so forth. The boat, my understanding is the boat went from there to the people who owned Budweiser. The Budweiser family somehow, I think it was renamed the Big Eagle at that point because of Budweiser's logo. And then from there, Belfort bought this boat. And I call it a boat, but it's really a ship. It's so big. And what he does to this ship almost cost him his life and his wife and a handful of other people. Because what he does is he cuts the boat in half and he has it made longer. And at the end, of this construction project, it's 175 feet long. And he had it made longer because he also added a section on the back of the boat where he had a helicopter. He also on this boat had a seaplane. It had a sort of a crane type of arm that would lift the seaplane up off of the boat and set it in the water. And from there the plane could take off. But he had a helicopter and a plane on this boat, which was worth millions. And of course, he put multi-million dollars worth of money into this boat.
They're talking about toys. Those are unbelievable toys.
Incredible. The helicopter alone, he purchased, I think, for $550,000, financing it to a bank out of Florida. The boat was worth multi-million dollars. What's interesting is they're in the Mediterranean. They're vacationing in Rome, and they're scheduled to go out to the island of Sardinia. And they go out into the ocean, and they hit a storm. And one of the waves from the storm goes over the front of the boat, and as it hits the boat, it smashes out all of the windows on the boat. And so every successive wave is now putting water into this boat. An SOS is sent out to the Italian Coast Guard. They can't come out and rescue the people until the following day, but they get everybody off of the boat. The boat flounders in the ocean by itself for a little while and ultimately sinks to the bottom of the ocean, taking all of its contents and all of the It was the boat, the airplane, the helicopter.
Oh my
I
God.
think they were towing a speedboat. It all goes to the bottom of the ocean. But here's another tremendous benefit of money laundering. Once the money is dirty, it's always dirty, regardless of what character the funds take on. Now, in this case, it started out as the victim's money. They wired it into the firm. They bought securities. Belfort steals the money. It's in his bank accounts. He buys the boat through wire transfers and checks. The boat sinks. There's an insurance policy on the boat. The Lloyd's of London pays off on the boat, and he buys the beach house in Southampton, Long Island. Well, that's how we were able to seize the home in Southampton, because we linked it back. We followed the money. I followed the money through those trails. And of course, at the end, Belfort pleads guilty to it all. So we didn't get to seize the boat, but we did get to seize the beach house. And the beach house was ultimately liquidated, and the proceeds went back. But that's Belfort's downfall. When he starts taking the cash overseas, he's stepping into a realm that I'm an expert at. I had a brand new prosecutor on the case at the time by the name of Joel Cohen, who was a fantastic prosecutor. He and I got along really well, became good friends. We clicked both professionally and personally, and literally within 18 months, we were done with the case. We wrapped up the case, and Belfort and Porsche were indicted. Both of them cooperated. We worked them both covertly over the next year, making not only telephone recordings but body recordings, and setting up meetings with other co-conspirators. Belfort and Porsche created an entire list of people with whom they had done dirty deals, whether it be through kickbacks or stock trading or other things. And we literally only worked laterally or up, meaning that a lot of the smaller fish that they did business with, we didn't have the resources to go after. But it was during that next year, after we disclosed Belfort's cooperation, he ended up testifying in trial around the country, helping out districts, prosecutions in California, in Florida, in New York. The benefit to him, he was facing 21 to 27 years. At sentencing, he was given 4 years for a $210 million fraud. Disappointing.
That's a significant reduction.
In my opinion, too much. I believe he should have done more time than that. But remember, securities cases weren't viewed as significant cases. I can give you examples since then, though, where it would be different today. For example, they changed after WorldCom and Enron and Tech Bubble and all of these financial fraud cases that hit the securities markets. After, and this comes years after Belfort's case is already closed, it's done, it's over, the securities laws were changed. When I was doing this case, the most you could get, the statutory maximum for securities fraud was 5 years. For money laundering, it was 20 years. Well, that's been enhanced now, where securities fraud actually has a stronger punch than money laundering does.
Wow. Because
of all those other cases. People who are being prosecuted for the same type of crimes today are getting huge sentences. One of the individuals I arrested through there was an original player in Stratton Oakmont, a man by the name of Irving Stitsky. I think in my case he was given 3 years probation. If you fast forward after this enhancement of the guidelines, he was prosecuted for what I would consider a very small real estate scam, but it was his third strike, it was his third arrest. He was sentenced to 85 years.
Wow, talking about payback, yeah.
Yes, yeah, clearly. So today, the results, I think, would be completely different. But you have to remember, this was a very early case. It was sort of one of the pioneering big manipulation cases created in 1992 with a brand new squad of people, brand new prosecutors, brand new tactics, brand new methods. The Bureau at the time wasn't really interested in trying creative techniques. They want to just focus on the securities. Today, they're more willing to use these new techniques combined with digital technology it's a different world now. It really is a different world. This case could be done in probably 1/3 the time with the technology and the knowledge that exists today. And I think these individuals could be stopped a lot quicker than we were able to stop Belfort and Porsche.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions, if I can.
Sure, absolutely.
Al Abrams. I mean,
Yes.
when you came in and did that initial case with Al Abrams, why do you think that it didn't click with Jordan Belfort at that time that, the FBI is looking at these cases now?
Well, what's interesting is, remember when Belfort started in 1989, there was no concern about law enforcement coming in. The only thing that they had considered was the Securities and Exchange Commission or the NASD, which are civil bodies. Basically what they do is they come in and they sue you. So the cost of doing business was whatever the SEC fine would be. They weren't really afraid of the SEC in that sense, because the worst that could possibly happen is they just get barred from the business, but they weren't going to put them into jail. That all changed, and I can tell you where I think the change came about. It came about because of the Michael Milken, Ivan Boesky, Drexel Burnham case.
Those names are very familiar, yeah.
And they were the big junk bond cases, and that really was sort of the focus of the Bureau when it created its squad. The FBI wasn't involved in those cases. That was actually postal inspectors. But the people at the time, the visionaries at the time at the FBI, said, look, this is going to be a big thing. And so that's why they created us in 1992. When Belfort started, he ran his firm from 89 to 92, and he really was not facing any criminal scrutiny at all. Zero. There was nobody out there.
When was your Al Abrams case? When was that?
That was in November of 1992.
So that was a warning to him, wasn't it? Because now it is a criminal case.
Absolutely. And I think that was the first warning. That was the first sort of change, the change that came about. And then it was shortly after that. That was November of 92. It was September of 93 when he started moving his money out of the United States and into Switzerland. That's a good question. I hadn't contemplated that. I wonder if any of his reasons for moving that was because of the fallout from that portion of the investigation. Good question, but I actually don't know the answer to that. But and then it was from there that he was barred from the business in 94, and we arrested him in November of, believe it or not, it wasn't until November of 98. But what's missing from that equation is, if you remember where I started saying that this was 3 cases or more rolled into one. What I really haven't discussed here is that all of the other people that we arrested along the way to the top. For example, one aspect of my investigation involved brokers who were paying other people to take their test in order to become a broker. We had people who would be paid $10,000. They would acquire a false ID with the name of another person, the picture and name of another person, and go and take that person's test to become a licensed stockbroker. And then they would go to work at Stratton Oakmont, Belfort's firm. And so of course, once you get into that, all you need is one person. And he says, well, I paid this person, and you keep following those people. And I was rounding up people related to test taking. And that was sort of the foundation of my bigger case. I had all of these people on all of these different crimes. We were arresting them for securities fraud. We were arresting them for test taking, and for money laundering and for kickbacks. And so there's this whole middle and bottom layer of people, which isn't reflected when I say that we opened it in 92 and we arrested Belfort in 98. It was a 6-year investigation. The other issue which slows it down a bit is, in order to get the records from Geneva, Switzerland, and from London and from Paris, we had to do a treaty request through the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty in criminal matters. And we actually pierced the secrecy veil in Switzerland and in these other jurisdictions, and we received the paperwork behind all of these bank accounts that he was laundering the money through. That takes time. For example, I can tell you, the Swiss were not very, they were not very bad to deal with. The Brits were great to deal with. The British were great to deal with. But we did a request to Liechtenstein, and it took them 7 years to respond to our request. Because you remember the climate at that time was not one of cooperation in money laundering cases. Their business was built on taking in money from people around the world. So in that particular case, those records were directly related to people who were related to this case. But I got those records after my case was closed. It was closed. The entire thing was closed. It took 7 years to get the records. What's interesting about white-collar crime cases is the money is generally laundered at some very nice locations. So in my particular instance, my prosecutor, Joel Cohen, and I, we did treaty request to Switzerland, and we requested to speak with the people who opened and transferred this money. So, I mean, as a nice benefit, we traveled to Geneva, Switzerland to interview these people as part of this investigation. That's compared to, if you're doing a drug case and you're running around the jungles of some country looking for people. I was sitting in some very nice lawyers' offices in government buildings in Geneva, Switzerland. So
very nice.
Sort of a funny benefit, yes. At the end of the day, look, Belfort pled guilty. He knew he was facing 21 to 27 years. Was only sentenced to 4. As agents, we learned that this is something that the government, the judges, that it's their sole discretion where to sentence somebody once they've cooperated. I've learned now to accept it. Do I think he should have gotten more time? Yes, I do. I think his crimes were serious enough. I understand them in the context of the time, but that's sort of a water under the bridge at this point.
Well, now, if we could spend some time talking about his books and the movie. And the first thing I want to ask you is, where did the name Wolf of Wall Street come from?
The name Wolf of Wall Street is, I think, a product of Belfort. I don't recall hearing him referred to in that way. I don't know if other people within the firm used to speak to him that way, or if that's something that he created as sort of a way to identify him when he was creating these books and movies. But for him, it was very effective. Don't know where the term came from, though. I don't recall people calling him that, but it's quite possible they did it inside the firm, and I just didn't know about it.
I was going to say, you talked about him creating a need by, selling something, and I think the most lucrative marketing tool that he has is, this calling himself the Wolf of Wall Street and marketing his own image, because, people know that. When I say that I'm going to interview the case agent of the Wolf of Wall Street case, people are going to say, oh, wow, because they all know about it. And it sounds like he was one of many people during this time period, but he's the one that sticks out because of his efforts to market his image, his books, and the movie. So that's my next question. What about this law that I thought was in place where you're not able to profit from your own crimes?
So I think that law, the original one was what they called the Son of Sam law, which was done by New York for the serial killer, Son of Sam. I don't believe that there's a federal equivalent to that law. I don't believe it's illegal to profit from writing books and selling the movie rights to your life in the federal system. I think what you're getting at there, which is an interesting point, is he's currently under a $100 million restitution order, meaning that he and his partner were both ordered by the court to pay restitution of, I think it's either $100 million or $110 million jointly and severally. Of that $110 million, probably $40 million has been paid back. $30 to $40 million is, I'm estimating these numbers. And that was the assets that we seized from Belfort and Porsche in the very beginning. And then a portion of the proceeds were paid out after Belfort got out of jail and had some income. It got paid back. The whole restitution issue is a complicated issue, which is handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. While I was a still agent, I offered my services to them to help collect money up until the point of my retirement. Of course, since my retirement, I'm not sure what, if anything, is being done. I know the judgment at this point, the program that was set up by the judge at sentencing was Belfort was required to pay 50% of his income during the 3 years that he was on probation once he left jail. After the 3 years, if he was released from probation, supervised release is the actual term, whatever the remaining balance was became a general judgment that the government was responsible for collecting.
So we spend a little bit of time talking about the victims because this is a huge, huge security fraud, but I take it that the victims are individuals who purchased these manipulated stocks.
Yes, Belfort's philosophy is actually quite interesting, and it led to different kinds of victims in this case. When Belfort started the firm, he thought to himself, look, I only have so many hours in the day. I only have so many people on the telephones. I'm going to focus on people who have small businesses. He wanted the entrepreneurial type. He knew that they were the people who had sort of the genes, the genetics to be speculative, to take chances on high flyers. And so in the early days, Belfort was very disciplined about targeting people who own small businesses. He would get Dun & Bradstreet lead cards. They would call these small business owners, and that was their focus for many years. It wasn't individuals. Belfort didn't want to target individuals. He didn't want to go after the mom and pop businesses or the retirement plans for a couple of reasons. One, he knew he could get more money out of a small business owner, and it would probably be an easier sell. But two, I think there was a genuine desire on his part not to create victims among retired people and school teachers and things like that. Those are the kind of things that draw attention to you quicker and take you out of business quicker, right? When you start defrauding retired people and school teachers and bus drivers and deli workers. And Belfort was very disciplined for many years. It was only towards the end, after Belfort was barred from the business, that it really spiraled out of control because the firm was taken over by his partner. It became, at the end, a free-for-all where they would steal money from anybody who had money. And that generated hundreds of little small victims throughout the country who, at some later point in time, were sent information by lawyers saying, look, these funds have been seized, they've been forfeited to the government, they've been liquidated. You need to submit your claim in order to get some of your losses back. Unfortunately, I think a lot of those people never submitted claims. I think a lot of them really only got pennies on the dollar back from the victim restitution pool. Although Belfort is ordered to pay $100 million in restitution, that's really not all money that was made by him. Remember, he had, at one point in time, 200 plus brokers on the telephones making money, all of whom were being paid. So even though the fraud amount is, overall the fraud amount is $210 million, it's not that he made $210 million personally himself. It's unfortunate that many of those victims will not get their money back, have not gotten their money back. And that's really the saddest part of this entire investigation, is the people who invested in these deals and really lost their life savings at some point to some pretty aggressive, pretty dishonest brokers who worked at this firm. And I think that's where it stands now, is that Belfort and the government has been negotiating back and forth for things like the movie rights and the book royalties and those type of things. I don't think they've reached an agreement as to exactly how this was going to pay back. But again, it's an issue that I wasn't directly involved with. It's not something that, as an agent, that I was required to do. So I can't really comment much more beyond that. The movie, I will say this about the movie. People look at the sex and the drugs and the crazy lifestyle. I will tell you, many people come up to me and say, that can't be true. That can't be accurate. And my answer to that is, you're right. It isn't accurate, because it was actually worse. Some of the conduct that occurred back then was really pretty bad and pretty excessive. I think the movie captures that aspect of what he did. We're talking, we had a lot of 20-something-year-old guys, and I say guys because it was probably 90% men, males, filled with testosterone at that point in their life, with millions of dollars to spend on every kind of illegal, illicit, unethical activity that you can imagine, and they engaged in it. So the movie did capture that. I do wish the movie had tracked some other aspects of the case more closely. I would say overall the movie is probably 70% accurate.
What's wrong? What would you have liked to see different? Yeah.
I don't think they ever made clear the difference between the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI and the two investigations. The SEC was done with their case by 1994. What Belfort was ultimately charged with had nothing to do with the SEC's case, although their case was the genesis of ours. I mean, you have to acknowledge that. But the crimes that Belfort committed, most of them, and certainly the international money laundering aspect of it, was not involved in the SEC case. They weren't involved in that. And in the movie, there's a merging of civil and criminal, SEC and FBI. I don't think they ever make that distinction clear at all. I think they merge the two together, and it's never made clear. The other aspect, for example, Belfort, when we arrest him, he pleads guilty and cooperates right away. In the movie, he's played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and in the movie he says, "Look, I'm not going anywhere. They're not coming. You'll have to come get me out of here." It's a big, rah-rah cheering type scene, but that actually isn't the way it worked. Belfort was actually much smarter than the character in the movie, because Belfort understood he's going to jail for 21 to 27 years if he doesn't cooperate against other people. Whereas in the movie, he does the stand-up thing and doesn't cooperate. Same thing is true for Todd Garrett, whose name in the movie is Brad. In the movie, he's a stand-up guy. He goes to jail. He doesn't rat anybody out. In reality, he cut a deal with us to give his wife a pass, and cooperated against Belfort and became a pretty good witness for us. Brought us some physical evidence, like deposit slips from the Swiss bank and things like that we ultimately used against Belfort. I just think some of the events in the movie, if they had tracked them closer to real life, it actually could have been a better movie. But I understand, hey, look, you're in the business, and movies is to make money. My only role, they did come to the FBI. My only role in the movie was to review a couple of the scripts as it relates to the person, my character in the movie. My sole function to cooperating with them was to try and make it as accurate as possible. I figured if they're going to at least portray me in this movie, try and make it as good as possible. I will say this, the individual that they chose to play me, Kyle Chandler, I did get to meet with him. Great guy, super guy, very down-to-earth guy. I thought he captured my attitude in that movie perfectly. I think one of the best scenes in that movie is one where we actually sat down and discussed, and it's the scene on the boat where Belfort attempts to bribe me. The interesting aspect of that scene is it didn't really happen. It's based on something that was going to happen. Belfort was going to bribe me. He was going to lure me onto this big boat with another agent and try and tempt me with prostitutes and alcohol and money, but he was convinced not to do it. When the people writing the screenplay learned of that, they wrote it into the script. It was not very well done in the original script, I will say. And I literally sat there at a conference table in the FBI's offices with Kyle Chandler and another screenwriter, and said, this is what I would do. If this occurred, this is the things I would say. This is how I would act. And Kyle Chandler plays that out in the movie, and I think he did a phenomenal job with that scene. And I think it sort of captures my attitude about the investigation and how I went about it. So I kudos to Kyle Chandler for pulling that off. And look, just as an aside, from a very personal perspective, it doesn't hurt to have a really good-looking guy play you in a movie, and actually a well-known movie. There is really no downside to having that happen.
Now, let me ask you a couple of questions about that character, because in the movie, the character is named Patrick Denham. and not Greg Coleman.
Yes.
Is there any particular reason for that? Would you have let them use your name? Did they want to use your name?
Yes, they came to me with a what's the word for it? A waiver. Let's call it a waiver. I don't know what the official name of it would be.
It sounds like it's right. Yeah.
Yes, where basically they could use my name, but it was so all-inclusive. They could use my name, my likeness, my persona into perpetuity. I intended to let them, originally I intended to let them use my name. Unfortunately, because of snafu with the person in the Office of Public Affairs in the Bureau, that form wasn't given to me until literally hours before they were due to start shooting those scenes. And unfortunately, the waiver was waiving rights to issues of the Bureau, which I didn't have the legal authority to waive. In other words, using the Bureau name and my likeness as an agent and all of my title and all those things, there were certain things in there, like I can give them the right to use my name, but I can't give them the right to use the FBI name. And there was a problem. That person in the Office of Public Affairs didn't handle it well, and only got that form to me hours before the filming began. And there was just no way to get that thing cleaned up to the point where I could sign it. And so ultimately they had to change the name of the character.
All right. Well, I know it's you, so.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Here's another question, because
I will admit that I gave Jordan Belfort a little bit of money because I bought his book.
But I bought that book years ago, and I actually don't even use a Nook anymore, and I had to go into my Nook to pull the book up, and I, read it. And it was very interesting because, first of all, he said that you were too nice to be an FBI agent, and then he also said that he nicknamed you OCD, and he hated the Assistant United States Attorney. He had a name for him, but since this is a clean podcast, I can't say that name out loud. What was your relationship with Jordan Belfort?
Well, let me address the prosecutor thing without going into name calling first. I understand that. I mean, you have to remember the prosecutor is the lightning rod here. Even though I'm doing all the work behind the scenes, the guy who he's the bearer of the bad news is the prosecutor. And so when we came to Belfort and we gave him an ultimatum, a deal that he had to take, and he had to take it within 24 hours or to be subject to the full prosecution, the prosecutor's the lightning rod for that. So I understand that the two of them did not get along, did not like each other. My style as an agent is completely different, though. I actually, and I'm a very laid back kind of guy. I can be nasty if I have to. I prefer not to. I prefer to be more cordial. In my relationship with Belfort is an interesting one because to this day I am still in touch with Jordan Belfort. But he's not the only one that I've arrested and sent to jail that I'm still in touch with. There's probably 5 or 6 people through the history of my career that I sent to jail, or certainly I arrested, maybe they received probation, that I'm in contact with. I now do, my outside career is, one of the things that I do is I speak publicly about this case in conferences. I did a conference recently in Florida, and I did one in Miami and one in Fort Lauderdale. And one of the nights I went to dinner with an individual that was arrested in our case. He's a defendant in our case. He pled guilty. He cooperated. And then a couple of days later, if you want to talk about chance in a small world, I'm in a hotel in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm due to speak at 10 o'clock in the morning in the same hotel on the same day at a different conference. Belfort is due to speak at 2 p.m. So, I mean, what are the odds of that the agent and the Wolf of Wall Street are in the same hotel at different conferences on the same day speaking?
Wow.
So what was interesting is I actually crashed his presentation. I snuck into his presentation and watched his So it was kind of interesting sitting in the audience where really nobody in the audience knew that I was sitting there watching the guy that I had arrested that was portrayed in this movie. So it was actually kind of fun. But here's my take. Here's the reason why I can still speak with a guy like Belfort. I don't take any of this personally. I never have. It's not about me and Belfort. I had a job to do. I was hired to investigate criminal activity. If it wasn't Belfort, it would be somebody else. Belfort is a criminal. He had his role. He knew his role wasn't to get caught. But in this case, he did. So for me, none of this is personal. It's not about me and Belfort. I'm an FBI agent. He was the criminal. If he was better at his job than I was at my job, then he gets away. If I'm better, I win, I arrest him, and we go on. People often ask me at these conferences what Belfort is doing today and do I speak to him and so forth. I don't wish Belfort bad. Was he a bad guy? Absolutely. Was he the worst of the worst at the time? Absolutely. The things he did, were they reprehensible and disgusting? Absolutely. But he pled guilty. He went to jail. My position on Belfort is this, and this is my position with everybody that I've ever arrested in my entire career. Once they go to jail and they serve their time, and if they pay their fine, I wish them well. I hope they do well. I hope they have clean, successful lives. I don't really have any negative feelings towards any of these people. They are what they are, and we all know when we do these cases, you run into people who are bad people. They will always be bad people. But then you run into some people who just choose a particular path in life that leads them to a very bad place. In Belfort's case, I think he's an incredibly bright individual. I think he's smart. He's creative. From a human standpoint, I wish him well. I wish him success. I hope he does well. He knows that if I were still an FBI agent, despite the fact that I wish him well, if he were to cross over the line and do something wrong again, I would turn on him in 1 second. It's not that way. Because again, for me, it's not personal. So he's out here doing what he's doing. I believe he's doing a lot of selling. He's doing a lot of public speaking. He pretty much took the sales techniques that he used in an illegal fashion back at Stratton Oakmont. He's cleaned them up. He's legalized them. And he's now teaching people those techniques and how to use them to sell, but to do it in a proper way. I know during his presentations, because I actually sat in on the one in Florida, he talks about that. He used this power in a positive way, not in a negative way. I think the guy could have been completely successful and very successful had he done it legally from the beginning. The difference is it would have taken longer. It would have taken more work. And he just didn't have that patience and that maturity to do it the right way. That's why I think he'll stay out of trouble, or at least I hope he stays out of trouble from now on in. I don't have any reason to believe that he won't. It's because he's smart. He's not stupid. He gets it. He knows how close he can to really spending a big chunk of his life in a federal prison somewhere. And so he's out there trying to do it in a clean way. Belfort, again, is not the only guy that I stay in touch with. I stay in touch with a number of people from my cases. You know, we speak. I wish them all well. Because for me, it's just never been personal. It's just my style. I'm pretty laid back. But, again, I can be aggressive if I have to.
Well, this has been really great. I mean, absolutely fascinating for me as a person who did this type of work during her career. So when did you retire?
January of 2015. So I just passed my third anniversary in retirement.
So what are you doing now?
What I did is I set up my own company. I have an anti-money laundering consulting firm. I specialize in suspicious activity reporting and training related to it. I pretty much do anything anti-money laundering related. I go in, I do reviews of programs, I make recommendations. My specialty is in the training. The part that I really enjoy the most is going into firms, financial firms, providing training on how to prevent and detect money laundering. I think the best part of my programs that I provide is that they're based on real life experiences. I use real life examples, of course, with redacted information. But I think there's a real need in the financial communities to understand how these things actually occur from a real-life perspective. Anybody can pick up a book and read the definition of money laundering, which is placement, layering, and integration. But what does that mean? That's just the bones of money laundering. And so I actually put the meat on the bones. I explain through real life, real cases, how things occur and what they should look for within the banking system. That's one aspect of my business. The other side of it is public speaking. I have a number of programs. My signature program, of course, is on the Wolf of Wall Street. The bulk of my time has been dedicated to doing those public speaking events, keynote events. I do it all over the world. Been to many countries in Europe, a few in the Middle East, through Central and South America. It's universally transferable to any kind of audience. But in addition to that one, I also do keynote presentations on cryptocurrencies, on money laundering in general, securities fraud, pretty much any kind of financially related program. And again, I think what people like about my programs are that I use real life examples to explain them. So it's been pretty busy. I've been spending a lot of time in airports and on airplanes traveling around the world.
How would someone get in touch with you?
They can reach out to me directly. My email and telephone number are on LinkedIn if they want to go through there. I encourage anybody who's interested in reaching out to me for either a keynote speaking event or for training or analysis relating to anti-money laundering. Give me a call directly, 646-660-1010. Or Gregory Coleman, 2015@gmail.com.
I'll make it easy for those who are listening who weren't able to jot down your phone number and your email. On my website, jerrywilliams.com, I will put that number and your email in this episode's show notes. I always like to give my guests the last word. So it could be about the FBI, it could be about this case. What would you like to say?
For me, the FBI has been the greatest career a person could ever have. I would do every day of it over again. I think it was the luckiest and best decision that I ever made in my life. I really enjoyed my career, despite some negative news that exists out there today. I'm still a big fan of the Bureau, and I constantly recruit people to join the Bureau, good people that I meet through my travels across the country. The Bureau is a part of me. It will always be a part of me. I think it helped me develop certain skills, which I now take into my private life, which are helping me to become very successful. The knowledge and people that I had access to during my career, I think it's just unparalleled in any other career that you could possibly have. So for me, it was clearly the best decision and most wonderful career that I ever could have had. So, and I get to do podcasts like this and talk about the work that I've done, which is always fun. So it's been a great run. And I have to say, it took me about 3 years of thinking about retirement to finally pull the trigger and leave. I really loved what I was doing up until the day that I walked out of the building. Could have been a workaholic, and in some cases I was a workaholic. Belfort, as you said, called me Special Agent OCD, which is obsessive compulsive. I prefer to think that I was just passionate about my work. He seems to think that I was obsessed with chasing him. Who knows, maybe a passion for your work and becoming obsessive compulsive about catching somebody, maybe they intersect at some point. The passion came naturally for me. I really just loved the hunt of tracing money and tracing people and tracing crimes.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Greg Coleman. You'll find newspaper articles related to this case and the making of the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, movie poster, and a link to Jordan Belfort's book, Catching the Wolf of Wall Street, which I found pretty interesting. If you enjoyed the interview, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. Social media share buttons are at the bottom of the show notes. And of course, if you're listening to this on a podcast app, you can share it directly from your device. So this week's crime fiction recommendation is my own book, Pay to Play. If you liked Wolf of Wall Street with all that sex, money, extortion, and more, well, guess what? That's what Pay to Play is about. A female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, and while investigating her subject, He's a combination between Jordan Belfort and Harvey Weinstein. She gets herself into a little bit of trouble too. So again, if you like Wolf of Wall Street, I think you're going to like Pay to Play. Pay to Play is available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. And I have another recommendation. This time it is a true recommendation because last week I told you about The Looming Tower, which is a 10-part series on Hulu, but I admitted that I hadn't watched it yet. I'm 3 episodes in and I absolutely love it. I don't have any critiques because so far they're getting it right. No cliches and misconceptions. I still hope to have one of the agents portrayed in the series on the podcast soon. I'm still waiting to hear back. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.